Kamala Harris and her supporters will do anything but to run on her record, to run on what she really believes, to run on what they will do to the country and what they've done to the country. It's not a mistake. It's not a coincidence that Liz Cheney, General John Kelly, General Mark Milley, all oppose Trump, all say he's a threat to humankind, all say he will use the military in horrendous ways. This is the military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower, one of the greatest generals in history, was talking about. And that's who Kelly is, that's who Milley is, that's who the Cheneys are. And, of course, Kelly does his interview with the New York Times, which is quite amazing. He does an interview with a corporation whose bureau chief in Berlin was an advocate for Hitler and the Third Reich, whose bureau chief in Moscow was an advocate for Stalin and the Soviet Union, whose reporter in Cuba was an advocate for Castro and communism. So John Kelly does this interview where he's trying to sink President Trump's re-election chances with these outrageous statements. Even the media, little pieces of it, have pointed out that his so-called recollection about Trump and Hitler's generals, that Kelly has said different things to different people. Now, I want to give you a little history lesson. And I'm going to say something here that people who are smart, who really know history, will shake their heads north and south, will shake their heads vertically, that is up and down, and say, you know what, the guy's right. First, let's talk about generals. Let's talk about Abraham Lincoln and his generals. Abraham Lincoln, by many, is considered the greatest, if not the second greatest president in American history. But he had a problem with many of his generals. Some of them were too political. Some of them wouldn't fight. Some of them were drunks. Some of them would whore around. He wanted to win the war. He wanted to get it over with. Abraham Lincoln micromanaged the Civil War. Virtually every night he would walk from the White House to the old executive office building. He'd sit in a room. He'd sit in a room where they had a telegraph. And he'd have the telegraph man read to him what was going on in the battlefields or what generals were saying. He watched it very, very closely. And he had real problems with some of these generals, like General John Fremont, General Benjamin Butler, General Carl Schurz, General John McClellan, General John Logan, General John Dix, of course, George McClellan, General Fitz John Porter, General David Hunter, General Winfield Scott, General Henry Halleck, General Joseph Hooker. It's a lot of generals. And what would Lincoln do? He would either tolerate them, but in most cases, he'd move them around to different positions. In some cases, he'd fire him. And some of them got very angry with him. As the great historian James McPherson wrote, when the generals did not live up to the president's expectations, Mr. Lincoln changed them. Ultimately, he was the commander-in-chief. Quote, even after Ulysses S. Grant became general-in-chief in March 1864, Lincoln maintained a significant degree of strategic oversight. Lincoln was a hands-on commander-in-chief who persisted through a terrible ordeal of defeats and disappointments to final triumph and tragedy at the end. What do you think the media would say about Abraham Lincoln today? This media, the American media, would run to these generals to get statements from these generals. Nobody ever heard what John Kelly has said that Donald Trump said. Nobody. And he's contradicted himself on different occasions. But it doesn't matter. Kamala Harris is a bottom feeder. She seizes on this. She's not really running substantively for president. First, she was hiding out for months. Then she does friendly interviews. Then she does a couple where she collapses of her own weight. Then she raises over $1 billion from Democrat Party oligarchs who are spending money lying about abortion, lying about Donald Trump, lying through her teeth. These commercials are made by propagandists. They're made by fancy New York publicity agencies. They're written by grifters, operators, pollsters, sitting at their desks, laughing about what they can do. They have no connection to reality. They're all about brainwashing you, lying to you. As I said, it's called propaganda. And she needs over $1 billion to do it. John Kelly was a disaster as chief of staff, and he was removed. These people have massive egos. Milley was a disastrous general who kissed Biden's ass and did what he was told, even if it meant losing Afghanistan, losing 13 heroes, God knows how many more American citizens. That's Milley. That's his record. He's a disgrace. He's like one of the disgraced Civil War generals. And then there's Mattis. Mad Dog Mattis. Another complete failure. They couldn't serve in these civilian positions. Mattis and Kelly and Milley, head of the Joint Chiefs. One of the greatest disgraces ever to sit in that position. So what do? They timed the remarks, which are not new. They're old, to try and influence and affect the election. Former generals. And the irony, of course, in this country, we're supposed to have a separation between citizens and military. I understand they're ex-military, but they still have a responsibility. They still have a responsibility. And they've timed their book, their statements to the New York Times and so forth, for maximum influence. Just like Putin, just like Xi, just like the Islamo-Nazi regime in Tehran. And in this issue, and in this way, and at this time, they're no better. They're no better. Because the American people need to focus on their future. The American people need to focus on the economy, the border. Yes, our military, which was hollowed out under Milley, which was hollowed out until Donald Trump stepped in and rebuilt it. And there's a reason why he'll get the support of the vast majority of the rank and file men and women in the military. There are great generals, and then there's this: Kelly, Milley, and Mattis. These constant references to Hitler. I think I'm going to do my opening statement either Saturday or Sunday on this, because I've had enough. Trump is a dictator. Trump is a dictator, says the Democrat Party. Says their media. Trump is a dictator. Historically speaking, accusing presidents of being dictators is nothing new. Nothing new. John Adams was accused of being a dictator when he and his party in Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. It effectively made it a crime to criticize the government. Pretty bad. Donald Trump never did that. President Andrew Jackson was accused of being a dictator. King Andrew Jackson, that's what they used to call him. He vetoed more bills than all his predecessors. When the Supreme Court went against his ideas of Indian removal, he responded, John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice, has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Gee, that actually sounds like Biden. The election of Abraham Lincoln, our greatest, one of our greatest presidents, his entire presidency was plagued with accusations of him being a dictator. He shut down 200 newspapers, including newspapers of the North that were anti the Civil War. Shut them down. He rounded up individuals, locked them in prison without reading them their rights in violation of the Constitution's habeas corpus provision. My recollection is he did that because these pro-Confederates, a mob basically, They were cutting the telegraph lines in Baltimore to prevent Washington from communicating with New York and Philadelphia, that is Washington, D.C., threatening the North during the Civil War. Congress passed a law and gave him the authority to do it. Eventually, the Supreme Court said, well, of course, Congress doesn't have that authority. Was he a dictator? You know what? Klansmen, neo-Nazis, and others have accused Lincoln of being a dictator, sympathizers with the conspiracy. Other individuals who aren't as poisonous in terms of their ideology have said the same thing. He also imprisoned people who spoke out against him. There's the case of an Ohio congressman by the name of Clement Vallandigham. He arrested him. He had him arrested because he declared that he was disloyal in the sentiments and opinions that he was giving in Congress. And instead of imprisoning him, Lincoln actually exiled him to live in the Confederacy. Donald Trump has never done anything like this. Woodrow Wilson, the great Democrat Party progressive, he passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts. He put a political opponent, a socialist, by the name of Debs in prison during a presidential election. He made it criminal to criticize the government and the World War I entrance that he insisted on, or the League of Nations that he wanted to create. He created the Committee on Public Information that turned into the nation's first propaganda machine. Franklin Roosevelt. He did more to turn the Constitution inside out, to expand the police powers of the central government than any president in American history, bar Joe Biden. When the Supreme Court started ruling against him, he threatened to pack the court. The executive branch became more powerful, in control of more legislation and regulations than any time in our history. And then he said he was the only one who could lead the country through World War II. He was the only one who could lead the country through the Depression. So he not only ran for a third term, he ran for a fourth term. Many called him a dictator, too. So now I want you to compare that to Donald Trump. I want you to compare them all to Donald Trump. They say Donald Trump is going to fill in the blank. But Donald Trump has never done any of it. He's never defied a federal court. He's never defied the Supreme Court. He's never violated the Constitution of the United States, ever. He peacefully left office. That's a matter of fact. They lie about January 6th. He offered the United States National Guard. They turned it down. They turned it down. And we could go on and on and on. They keep talking about him being Hitler. I'm now convinced half the country don't even know what Hitler did. And so I'm going to educate them Saturday or Sunday. And I'm sick and tired of Democrats using one of the most horrific genocidal events in world history against other human beings as a club against their political opponents. Goldwater was Hitler, Nixon was Hitler, Reagan was Hitler, and now Trump's Hitler. Donald Trump is a law-abiding public servant who's running for office again to try and protect us from those who are trying to destroy the Constitution, whether it's separation of power, whether it's the independence of the Supreme Court, whether it's the Electoral College, whether it's the Appointments Clause of the Constitution, whether it's free speech and freedom to assemble, whether it's the right to bear arms, whether it's probable cause to issue specific warrants, not general warrants, whether it's due process, equal protection or the 5th and 14th Amendments, whether it's the 6th or 8th Amendment or the 9th or 10th Amendment. He is the one who's standing up to these thugs